That's correct. Then thing it.
You good?
And then start it. Just start the station.
It's not. Yeah, I'll go there. And it should start.
That's what I'm saying. The switch over.
There are little glitches.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's working. Okay, perfect. We just want to make sure we can switch back and forth. Thank you.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before anything, can you please switch off your cell phones or at least put them on silent? It gives me great pleasure to introduce the three people who are here this afternoon who weren't with Rembrandt during the week, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Aneta Georgievska-Shine, who teaches at University of Maryland and is associated with the Smithsonian Museums in Washington. She's an art historian, and I would suggest a very, very good lecturer, knows her subject inside out, and I'm sure the next 2 hours are going to be very, very fruitful in terms of a learning experience. I hand you over to Aneta.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to all of those who were attending the Rembrandt lectures once again. In a certain way, it would have been very useful to hear the Rembrandt lectures before you hear the one about Vermeer, the double lecture, because they are living at the same time in Holland. And what we're talking about is Rembrandt is older. Rembrandt was born in 1606. Vermeer was a generation younger, 1632. Rembrandt dies in 1669. Vermeer dies the next decade. So even though he was much younger than Rembrandt, he did not have a very long life. But they were contemporaries. And yet, did they know each other? We have absolutely no documents. We have no knowledge of any intersection between these two contemporaries who are now considered perhaps the two greatest Dutch artists of the 17th century. So Holland is very small, but Holland was also very big. People traveled, they knew of other artists. Rembrandt was very well known in his lifetime, as we heard, and actually even Vermeer was very well known. In fact, at one point, Vermeer was the head of the Guild of St. Luke in Delft. But Vermeer lived in Delft and never traveled. Rembrandt lived in Amsterdam, came from Leiden, and didn't travel much either. So they must have known each other by reputation, but it would have been fascinating to imagine what would have happened had Vermeer and Rembrandt sat down to talk about painting. Vermeer, with all of these small jewel-like works, only 30-some paintings. I call 30-some because there is still an open question about an attribution or two. 36 paintings is the generally accepted number. So he dies in his mid-40s. He paints only 36 paintings that survive. What was he doing other than painting? You might wonder. Well, the problem is that we know so little. Even though Vermeer is now one of the most universally beloved artists among the old masters, we really know very, very little about him. And I'm just going to show you this slide with some basic information about what we do know. So there is a baptism certificate from 1632 in Yellowjacket in Delft, October 31, meaning he was probably born October 29th. 1653, he registers his intentions to marry Catharina Bolns. Catharina Bolns is a daughter of prosperous people from Delft, Maria Thins and Reinier Bolns, and she is a Catholic. And at that point, Vermeer apparently converts to Catholicism, because that was a condition set by her parents. And he moves in to the house of the parents, or rather the mother-in-law, because the father-in-law has passed away. So Vermeer, at that point, moves into the house of his mother-in-law, and that's where he spends the rest of his life. So if you know Vermeer's rooms, those famous interiors, they're probably, in one form or another, the interior of the house of his mother-in-law. Then the next information we have is that later that year, he becomes member of the Guild of St. Luke in Delft, which is the official painters' guild. And this is 1653, and this is probably the earliest possible date for the paintings by Vermeer. We don't have anything dated before that. And actually, even 1653, there is a question as to which of the surviving paintings may be from that date. Then you can see here that Vermeer is appointed one of the headmen of the Guild of St. Luke in 1662. And the last document in 1675, when he was 43, borrowed 1,000 guilders from a certain man in Amsterdam, using as a collateral a restricted obligation under the custody of the Orphan Chamber of Gouda for 2,900 guilders. And this is something that Maria Tins, his mother-in-law, had been entitled to. That's the last document that he's borrowing money, 1,000 guilders. So he didn't make a lot of money, it seems. Well, if he only painted 36 paintings. He doesn't seem to have been somebody like Rembrandt, who was constantly producing and constantly engaging with art patrons. As a matter of fact, if you can imagine this man, he was like a gentleman artist, sitting in one of these nice rooms in the house, in the Catholic part of Delft, painting very slowly, and kind of going back to the painting a couple of months later, continuing to work. And in a number of cases, there are pentimentian changes. He would let the painting dry, then go back, then decide that he didn't like an element, then he would change it. And he didn't seem to be going out and selling actively. But we do know that there was a Frenchman who traveled through Delft in the late 1660s, early 1670s, and said, while I was in Delft, I visited the studio of their most famous artist, or their very well-known artist, Johannes Vermeer. I went and I saw that he was working on several small paintings. They were very beautiful, but awfully expensive. So he put high price on his pictures and doesn't seem to have sold much. And the mother-in-law probably wasn't very happy about that, because when he died, that last paragraph you can see, and he was buried in the Oude Kerk in Delft, he left an impoverished widow and 11 children, 10 of whom were still minors. There were a total of 14 children in the house that were born to the two of them. They had lots of kids, lots of kids. 11 survived, and she was bankrupt. And she actually had to sell most of the surviving works. There is an inventory drawn upon his death, and every single thing, this is one other document we have, is itemized. Pots, beautiful silver chalice, if there was one in the house, because it was a good house. A yellow jacket lined with fur. Even that would have been itemized. All of the surviving paintings that were in the house. She even had to pay the baker. They were owing money for bread and flour. So there are lots of mysteries still connected to Vermeer. But you wouldn't know about any of these hardships if you looked at his beautiful, tranquil paintings, in which everything seems to be, so calm and so at peace with itself. And here I'm showing you the first large painting, and one of the very, very few large paintings that he ever paints, because he's the master of the jewel-like small works, as we know. Interiors, typically with one woman doing something, reading a letter, writing a letter, pouring milk. He doesn't paint landscapes, except for this fantastic cityscape, A View of Delft. And I titled this, it's called The View of Delft, and it's dated to the late 1660s, and as you can imagine, in Vermeer's case, just like in Rembrandt's case, there are all kinds of questions about dating of the works. And The View of Delft is dated to 1664, sometimes 1668. There is a tiny little monogram here on one of the boats that identifies it as a work of Vermeer. But even when paintings are dated and signed, they can be still fake, because people can add signatures, recreate so-called Vermeers, etc. And it was done very successfully in the 20th century. So I'm starting with this painting because it is so exceptional, and because it exudes this sense of tranquility and being in this very quiet, perpetually quiet, contemplative realm. Even when he's outside looking at the city of Delft, his own city that he doesn't seem to have left ever. Although, I have to correct this, he did go to Amsterdam a couple of times, we know that as well, that he traveled to Amsterdam, so he may have met Rembrandt and other people. And when he was in Amsterdam, he worked as an appraiser of fine art, or he was called as a consultant to appraise some Italian paintings, to authenticate, which means people respected his judgment as an artist. So he had a certain reputation as a knowledgeable man. But here, in this wonderful view of Delft, there is no hustle and bustle. There is none of that sort of Dutch busyness and people working hard, diligently going about. No, it's like a Sunday morning, and these people are chatting by the boat. These two women have stopped to talk. The sun is slowly moving and the clouds are moving, and all of a sudden what was in shadow becomes illuminated, and you catch these wonderful little glimmers of light on the buildings here, on the bricks, on the water, the reflections. All of a sudden what is deeply shadowed becomes illuminated. And that leads me to these illuminated parts, because for Vermeer, like for Rembrandt, art is all about light, presence of light, absence of light, light and shadow. Everything is modeled through this presence and absence of light. And this is also a perfect example of a nearly photographic image. To just introduce that right from the get-go, that whole discussion as to whether Vermeer used lenses, optical instruments, primitive sort of cameras known as camera obscura, dark box with a little pinhole and a lens, and as you look inside, you see what is in front of you projected on the base of the box, and you can kind of copy what you see. But this is way too big to be a copy of any photographic image that he can see from a camera obscura, right? So the idea is probably that Vermeer did use optical instruments, but at the same time that he used them as a guide of sorts. But then when you think about this picture, the other puzzling question is, like, did he go out there and stood and painted it? Most likely not. Plein air painting, or painting outside, did not happen until later in the 18th century. So even this exquisitely rendered, very atmospheric view of Delft was most likely a kind of artifice, something that he did in his studio on the basis of looking carefully and drawing. And that leads me to the next point. There isn't a single drawing by Vermeer. We have 36 objects, and not a single sketch. So he must have used something to prepare himself. Maybe he was this super, how shall I say, careful guy who didn't want people to see imperfection in his work. And maybe when he created drawings, he destroyed them. I cannot imagine how he could ever create all these paintings without a single drawing. He's not the only one in history of art like that. As a matter of fact, Caravaggio doesn't have drawings. Drawings by Caravaggio don't exist, for instance. So it's an interesting story right there. Why did he destroy his drawings? He wasn't happy with them. He didn't want anything but perfection, perhaps, which is why he worked so laboriously for months and months, perhaps even years on a single piece. But this illuminated passage reminds me of Vermeer's Rediscovery. And you may know already, because we all love Vermeer and read about him, that soon after his death, he was all but forgotten. And Vermeer was slowly rediscovered towards the end of the 19th century, when one art historian from France began going from museum to museum and published eventually an article in Gazette des Beaux-Arts where he said, there is this painter who is worth looking at more carefully. Most of the works by Vermeer at that point had been attributed to his contemporaries like Gabriel Metzu, Peter de Hoogh. I'll show them to you in a moment. But after the rediscovery of Vermeer by this particular art historian, Thore Berger, actually there is a great fashion for Vermeer. And Marcel Proust, I'm showing you here just an excerpt from Marcel Proust from one of the parts from his, of course, multi-volume book In Search for Lost Time, right? One of the classics of modernist literature. Marcel Proust writes a beautiful passage about Vermeer that becomes sort of identified with that quintessence of what Vermeer is all about. Bergotte is the character in the novel of Marcel Proust. And this is part of that passage, that Bergotte is ill, the character, he cannot sleep, and then he had read in the newspaper that the view of Delft was to be seen in Paris, a painting he adored and imagined he knew by heart. Though the article had referred to a little patch of yellow wall in the picture as being like a priceless specimen of Chinese art, or a beauty that was sufficient in itself. And worryingly, Bergotte could not recall the particular patch of yellow. And of course, art historians, being art historians, have tried to figure out what was Marcel Proust referring to when he wrote about the beautiful yellow patch of yellow, the beautiful yellow patch of wall. And I will show you one other excerpt with the detail of the painting. Bergotte goes to the exhibition in Paris. This is all in Proust. And this is what we have as the next passage. At last he came to the Vermeer, which he remembered as more striking, more different from anything else he knew. He fixed his gaze like a child upon a yellow butterfly that it wants to catch on the precious little patch of wall. And then he adds, "That's how I ought to have written," he said. "My last books are so dry, I ought to have gone over them with a few layers of color, made my language precious in itself like the little patch of yellow wall." And then apparently as he looks at this painting, Bergotte faints in front of it. And then they take him out of the museum. And apparently these are also some of the last pages that Proust writes, and he dies shortly thereafter. So it's a very amazing story. So when you look at this, where is the yellow patch? The yellow patch could be this roof, it could be this roof, it could be probably this one, but does it really matter? What matters here is the whole idea that this writer, both Proust and his alter ego Bergotte in the book, recognized that for Vermeer, the greatest meaning of these pictures is in their visual poetry. Beauty. You don't know why you like this, but there is something so pleasant, so lovely when you look at it, and you don't know exactly why. And we don't need to know why. So this painting, for example, is part of an existing genre. In Holland of the 17th century, there were many painters painting profile views of their cities. But just to compare it for a moment, look at how his contemporary, Hendrik Vroom, painted Delft, sometime between 1615 and 1634. A whole generation before, 30 years earlier, but it's night and day. There is such optical sensitivity, there is such fantastic beauty of colors, juxtapositions of these reds and yellows and whites and grays and that wonderful blue of the sky. Look at this in comparison. Just another second-tier 17th century Dutch painting, right? So not all artists are created equal, and as an art historian, I'm terribly old-fashioned where I claim that there are masterpieces and there are lesser works, because we sometimes these days tend to like to see everything in terms of visual culture and products of a visual culture, as if the whole idea of genius was super dangerous to mention. But I'm not politically correct in that respect. So, I firmly believe that there are some people who fall from another planet, basically, like Vermeer, or Rembrandt for that matter. They just don't think like everybody else around them. And hopefully, we will see more of those examples of thinking differently. So what was Delft of Vermeer's time? Just to show you a couple of paintings. It was a thriving center, artistic center, just like Amsterdam. There were plenty of wealthy people who wanted pictures for their homes. But Delft artists in particular loved small and fine pictures. So that so-called fine manner that we talked about is characteristic for most of Delft school. Regionally speaking, they loved smaller and very, very finely executed works. And of course, still lifes become a very important genre in 17th century Holland. And I'm mentioning here that term microcosm, macrocosm, which is so important for Renaissance art and Renaissance thought. The idea that whatever you look at, it contains within itself the idea of God or the creation. Beautiful shell, beautiful flower, beautiful fruit. Especially in Northern Europe, Italians are not quite as obsessed with this microcosm, macrocosm as are the Northerners. So that idea that, you know, even the deepest secrets of our world can be disclosed by small objects. But, as you can tell, they love precious objects, they love imports. But look, beautiful imported Chinese vase surrounded by bugs. Beautiful shell with a hermit crab inside. This is Balthasar van der Ast from Delft. Beautiful apples beginning to rot away. They're also very obsessed with the notion of decay, impermanence, vanitas, the idea that everything beautiful is very ephemeral, and that art captures what life cannot. So art provides sort of this illusion of eternity that real nature in all of its beauty can never attain. And that's what these still lives are about. And here is Balthasar van der Ast again with these wonderful studies of a lizard and a shell. So I'm showing you this to give you a sense of where Vermeer grew up. And his father, by the way, we do know that he came from a family of tapestry makers or tapestry dealer. So his love of textiles may have come from growing up in that kind of family. So he knew about art of this kind, art that was interested in capturing the most minuscule aspects of nature and the visible world. The Dutch, of course, are not only great explorers in 17th century, but, as we mentioned in the context of Rembrandt, map makers, cartographers, scientists. And on that note, I want to introduce one particular scientist from his milieu, whom you know probably, some of you, Antony Van Leeuwenhoek. Exact contemporary in terms of date of birth, 1632. And very important, as one of the first people to kind of use a primitive, rudimentary form of microscope. And you can see he made the first documentation of muscle fibers, bacteria, spermatozoa, blood flow in capillaries. Super important. He looked under the lens and saw little things moving and said, wow, there is more than what the eye tells us is happening. And he was probably instrumental in making Vermeer aware even more of the notion of microcosm and macrocosm, the large world versus that very small world that can only be observed under magnifying lens. Do we know that Leeuwenhoek and Vermeer knew each other? Yes, most definitely. Most definitely they knew each other. This is a portrait of Van Leeuwenhoek by another artist from the time period. He had a much longer life, as you can tell. But look at this, a globe, all kinds of texts in front of him, an oriental-looking robe. It was very fashionable to wear oriental robes. It became known as the scholar's robe in 17th century Holland. Nice, beautiful, long hair. This would be a typical portrait in Holland of a dignified gentleman who is also a scholar and a scientist. And these are just two images. A drawing by Van Leeuwenhoek, microscopic section of ash tree. And then this is a replica of a microscope. So did he know Van Leeuwenhoek? I mentioned, yes, he did. As a matter of fact, Antony Van Leeuwenhoek was executor of the estate of Vermeer. So the wife knew him as well. So if Vermeer was interested in lenses, he probably had a very good person to talk to with Van Leeuwenhoek and camera obscura. Another person who has sometimes been mentioned in conjunction with Vermeer is Spinoza. And that's a difficult one to make, except that many people keep going back to Spinoza, the philosopher, who was, of course, expelled from the Jewish community in Amsterdam, and who had to make a living as a lens grinder, and was also very interested in optics. And insofar as Spinoza goes, just a couple of things that are very important to highlight here are that he probably is the first person in history of Western philosophy who expresses a highly skeptical attitude towards God as understood conventionally in the Judeo-Christian tradition. What Spinoza said, that there is no God per se, but God is nature. Everything is God. There is no entity outside itself. Nature itself, with all of its manifestations, is what we call God. And this was quite heretical and dangerous, as you can well imagine. He also doesn't believe in the immortality of the soul. That's why he was excommunicated in 1656. And this is just one proposition, that God is a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. And that all of the things in nature proceed by a certain eternal necessity. So this is very, very radical proposition. And Spinoza was quite well known. He did know people like Leeuwenhoek. And as you can well imagine, somebody who is doing all those lenses and looking at little microorganisms under magnifying glass and saying, well, where is this God? And is God in every single thing I see? I'm dwelling on this because I think it relates fundamentally to Vermeer's approach to painting, because he never really aspired to be a great history painter. He thought that if he can paint a single figure in a room, that is already the world. He doesn't need to paint the whole world. That every single figure in a room can be already a world. So, also another thing which I want to mention is, since I talked about optics, is that there were several people very prominent regarding the science of optics. One of them, Jakob Spores in Delft, was the notary of Vermeer and his mother-in-law in 1674. Another was a friend of Spores, a military engineer who made an optical device in 1654, most likely a camera obscura. Also, Van de Weyck also made microscopes, telescopes, and apparatus that was a perspective box. And then Herman Steenwijk, brother-in-law of the Leiden painter David Bailey, was another person who was working with these perspective devices. So, what does this tell you? Vermeer was surrounded by this whole group of people interested in optics, lenses, mirrors, boxes for projection. So he's certainly not alone in his fascination with the camera obscura. And just to illustrate, you see, as a result of this interest in optics, there was also a heightened fascination in Delft with perspective. How do you make beautiful perspective and beautiful buildings and very interesting, unusual views into buildings? Mathematical conception of space. Here is an example by Gerard Hooggeest, the interior of the new church in Delft from 1650. And here is another one, like a two-point perspective with two recession points, which is also the new church in Delft with the tomb of William the Silent, who was considered a great hero for the Dutch, of course, because of his struggle for independence of the Dutch Republic. So the point is that there was a lot of knowledge of mathematics, geometry, perspective, optics, biology, and Vermeer was right there. And he was informed by this, even though we do not know much about his formal training. By the way, for Rembrandt, we know who were his teachers. For Vermeer, we do not. He kind of comes out just like that with those first documents when he gets married and when he signs into the Guild of St. Luke. But there is no record of, we know that his father was in tapestry business, but who trained him, when, how, remains another mystery. But we do know that some of his older contemporaries probably had an input somehow. Balthasar van der Ras, the still life painter, through those beautiful still lifes, the love of color, the detail, the refinement of painting. And then this other guy, Karel Fabricius. This guy is amazing too. Except there are even fewer paintings by him than by Vermeer. Karel Fabricius was also associated with Rembrandt, possibly as a student of Rembrandt. In fact, he was. But this particular image, he moved from Amsterdam to Delft, or maybe he came from Delft originally. He had the studio in Delft. This is a very interesting two-point perspective view of Delft, very, very small, almost like a panoramic shot. And it was probably put in some kind of a box device and may have been even rounded a little bit in display to create a sense of a small diorama. So you would peep into the box and look at this view of Delft, which explains a little bit the eccentricity of the perspective. And this is, of course, the artist himself sitting behind the bars, the bars that can be a symbol for the obstacle, visual obstacle, or maybe a way of measuring things by looking through those lines, the vertical lines. And behind him, you see a musical instrument, a lute, and a cello. And remember, or viola da gamba, I'm not quite sure what it is, but one of those string instruments. Remember that music and painting are aligned as sister arts, and that this artist, Karel Fabricius, puts his signature right here where the shadow of the lute falls on the wall to tell you, I'm sort of a musician in paint. Many artists made intimations of that kind, that their visual arts are comparable to musical compositions. The same is true of Vermeer, but tiny little painting. This is our Karel Fabricius, 1654. You remember Rembrandt Self-Portraits with the Georgette, that metal breastplate that he's wearing? Here comes another guy like that, with a little black cap, right? And probably the most famous of Karel Fabricius' paintings is the Goldfinch. Yes, 1654, the Goldfinch, which is truly like a sister painting of Vermeer. In a very strange way, it's like they're breathing the same air. That idea of something very small, very finely done, very simple, but somehow full of meaning, and you don't know exactly what it means. But there is this strange beauty about this pale yellow, right? And this little bird, captive with its little chain on the box. Karel Fabricius, 1654. Why do we have so few paintings by Fabricius? Because in 1654, there was an explosion in Delft in the storage facility for gunpowder. And Karel Fabricius' studio was right next to it. And it blew up and destroyed most of his works and killed him. So Fabricius, when he died, that was considered a big tragedy for the artistic culture of Delft. Like the best painter has died in Delft. And Fabricius, that young fellow you saw, dies in that gunpowder explosion, storage facility, and Vermeer essentially comes on stage then. He becomes member of St. Luke's Guild in 1653, so just a year before the death of Fabricius. So here he is again, and that's why we have so few paintings by him, sadly. So, what else is happening in Delft? Just to conclude this little introduction. What else is happening is love of interior scenes. Here is just one example. Again, Delft artists, Vermeer is not the only one who paints a lot of interiors. They love what they call scenes of daily life, the ordinary, finding beautiful in the ordinary. Here is a later artist, Hendrik van der Burg, 1660, he paints this interior. And what is interesting about this particular interior is that there are no people in it, but there is a little fur-lined jacket and a slipper. And that's kind of interesting because it has vaguely sexual quality, like the clothes that were taken off. But if you see an empty slipper and the girl is not there, you can imagine she's in bed. Something like that. And there is a little door, and there is a little bit of suggestion of intrigue going on here. But most of them, including Peter de Hoogh, who is the guy that has often been mentioned side by side with Vermeer, and often confused with Vermeer, focused on domestic interiors in which people are going about their business and they're all decent housewives and they're taking care of the house, folding linen, taking care of the children. These wonderful poetic renderings of extremely ordinary scenes of daily life. So I mentioned when Vermeer was rediscovered, that took place over a couple of decades. most of the paintings that were in the museums at that time and that are by Vermeer were called Pieter de Hoog. And then as Tore Burger, the art historian who began studying them, went around and said, hold on 1 second, this is not Pieter de Hoog. I see a tiny little monogram, I am. It's the same monogram I saw on another one. I see this V here. And then he began deciphering these monograms and slowly put together the basic corpus of works associated with Vermeer. Finally, one other thing that I want to mention in this introduction about Vermeer's milieu is, of course, the Caravaggisti. You remember in my discussion of Rembrandt, I said that in the teens, after the death of Caravaggio in 1610, a group of Dutch artists traveled to Rome. And they really, really wanted to bring Caravaggio's style to Holland. And Hendrik ter Bruegen is one of them. They were from Utrecht, and they were Catholic. Utrecht being the most Catholic part of Holland. And what's really interesting is you can see clearly where Caravaggio is behind this work. The figures that are very close to the surface of the painting, looking very sculptural, very strong chiaroscuro, right? Dramatic illumination by candlelight in this case, and dramatic shadows. Figures that look exotic. Also the whole idea of music as a subject. You see, Hendrik ter Bruegen almost outdoes Caravaggio and his lute players when he creates his own Caravaggesque version of music makers. But whereas Caravaggio is painting these very idealized youths who look vaguely angelic, singing together, ter Bruegen, while he makes them exotic and non-Dutch, he also makes them rather real, corporeal, of this world. And let me mention, he's one of the Caravaggisti. There are several others. Dirk van Baburen, Gerrit van Honthorst, a number of different painters. But what's even more interesting is that Vermeer's mother, the Catholic, Maria Thins, owned several of these Caravaggesque paintings. So if Vermeer wanted to learn about these pictures, he had them in the house where he lived. And that leads me to the very first painting, or one of the earliest paintings associated with Vermeer. You might see this for a moment and say, what's going on? This is not our Vermeer. And it is not our Vermeer. It's a very awkward group portrait of a young man with the black felt cap, raising his glass of wine next to this scene of essentially love for sale. It's known as the procuress, that person in black, who is actually a woman, an older woman like a madam in a brothel. Inn is a brothel, they're all interchangeable in 17th century Holland. She has just arranged for the client to purchase the nice young girl. The girl extends her hand to get the coin. So this is a brothel scene. So Vermeer starts out with pictures like this, which is very much out of character for him. But this is a big painting, more ambitious in scale, and because it has multiple figures in it, would have been appropriate for a young artist who aspires to be recognized among his contemporaries as somebody who can do multifigural dramatic compositions, almost like a history painter. He realizes very quickly that this is not his forte, putting multiple figures together. And I personally, no matter how much I love Vermeer, I have a feeling that he refrained from composing pictures with many figures because he just couldn't do it quite right. And he focused on smaller, 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 and finer and more minimal, because that was far more natural to him. So, what is interesting about this picture, the Procuress, is that you already see certain Vermeerian qualities in it, such as the beautiful carpet, right, in the foreground. You also see his wonderful sense of color, the reds and yellows there. But this idea of moralizing picture about people in a brothel is simply not his nature, to be sitting around talking about how corrupt people are. This painting, which is now in Boston in the Fine Arts Museum by another of those Caravaggisti, Dirk van Baburen, also known as the Procuress, may have been the direct influence on Vermeer's Procuress. Why? Because we know that this one was in her house, in Maria Thins's house. So in Boston, there is the painting that was recorded in the house of Maria Thins. So you can see here the guy, again, advancing towards the girl, she seducing him with her lute, and the dealer here, the lady, is pointing to her hand saying, show me the money first. That's basically what's going on. So artists of 17th century Holland loved these paintings of moralistic, didactic quality, like, look how bad people can be. And when you have a picture like this on your wall, you have it as a negative example. So when your guests come and you talk, you say, ha ha, we are so much better. We are so much better than this. We could never be prey to such cheap seduction, etc., etc. But there is more to this. There is more to this, because I feel, and the more I look at this, the more I feel certain in that, and many other art historians feel, that this is actually a self-portrait. And I'm going to show you just for a moment again Rembrandt's self-portrait as the prodigal son with Saskia, grinning quite unseemly in these rather unappealing big pictures from Dresden, where he puts his wife on his lap like a girl in a brothel, excuse me, right? Wasting the money away. And how Vermeer here, grinning again under the black felt cap, is raising his own glass of wine while his own girl is being sold to somebody. And that actually leads me to one other speculation, or one other supposition here, that that girl, however funny this may sound, is his young bride, Katharina Bones. Because if Rembrandt showed himself with Saskia, if Gabriel Mezzo, another contemporary, showed himself in an inn with his wife, if Jan Steen, another guy from the time period, showed himself with his wife as a prodigal son in an inn, then who else is the girl in yellow? And we'll come back to her face, because that face will come out in a number of other paintings. But this is an early work, he's still learning. And then you might wonder, why is he showing his wife being sold and bought? I have an answer. Because for Vermeer, most of his paintings will be inspired by a beautiful woman in a room. The woman is the muse, the eternal muse. His wife is also his muse, the way Saskia was for Rembrandt. They had just gotten married 2 years earlier. And if his paintings are about the beautiful woman, then it's that beauty that he is selling to clients. So this is not a selling of his wife, it's the selling of his work inspired by the beautiful woman. Does that make sense? Not really. Okay, we can think about it. We can think about it. I know it's not the kind of narrative about Vermeer that we are used to. There he is, maybe grinning under that cap. And these are some of the early works. And I wanted you to see this one from the Metropolitan because of that carpet. And because of the girl. You see that generalized similarity there between the face of the young woman in the procuress and the girl asleep? I'm not saying it's exactly the same figure, but there is a certain generalized female type that you will find in Vermeer. And why I'm mentioning this picture is because it's one of the earlier works. It's in New York. America has disproportionately large number of Vermeer paintings. Why? Because he was discovered very late, and at that time, American collectors had lots of money, and the big museums were being created. So we have a number of paintings in Washington, a number of paintings in New York, Boston. I mean, truly, not half, but 1/3 of Vermeer's pictures are in America, I would say. So, the Frick collection in addition to Metropolitan. But look, Vermeer paints a woman asleep. When you look at this, you do not think of a lazy servant falling asleep in the kitchen. You're looking at this as an image of a nice human being who is tired and fell asleep at the table. And she doesn't look like the servant figure either. My point being that from the get-go, even though he uses iconography or the kinds of subjects that are well established in the visual culture, he always twists them, modifies them, changes them, makes them his own. And in this case, I want to show you a typical picture of the time period by one of his contemporaries, Nicolas Maes. He was also confused with Maes, and they are oftentimes seen as being very, very close stylistically. So, if I show you these two together, Nicolas Maes is your typical Dutch moralistic genre painter. He's a good artist, but he likes to tell you what's the moral of the tale. The servant was asleep, the mistress came, chastised her, you shouldn't be like that, young girls should be hardworking, etc., etc. Vermeer starts from that subject and refuses to go in that direction. So one of the key aspects of his artistry is that he refuses to explicate, he refuses to tell you the entire story, and he really refuses to moralize. Even his procuress is somehow rescued from immediate moralization. Furthermore, he oftentimes, as I said, will paint something and then change his mind and subtract in order to add an air of mystery or uncertainty to his work. X-rays, and we have X-rays and reflectographs of his pictures, show that in this case there was an outline of a male in profile with a hat in the doorway. That would have made the painting more moralistic. She fell asleep, the guy is coming through the door, who knows what will happen, etc. Dutch loved those novelistic pictures with lots of story, lots of incidents. But Vermeer first painted that man, and then he decided to eliminate the figure. It was just too much. It would have been too much like Nicolas Maes. So this is the first thing that we have to understand. When we think about why Vermeer appears mysterious, it is because, on the one hand, he uses all kinds of commonplaces and accepted subjects from his culture. But at the same time, he subtly subverts, twists, kind of counters these accepted notions and expectations of the viewer. And he always tells us, how can you judge? Can you really judge what's going on in here? Why is the girl sleeping? So this is what makes him special, among other things. Let me just show you this detail. Sorry. Because in this detail you can also see that love of textiles. And you can also see something else in this detail, which is that there is an absence of firm outlines. But the sfumato in Vermeer seems to be governed by extensive periods of looking through lenses. And you know, when you look, if you have done experiments with camera obscura and look through the lens to see how are the images projected, I have seen that the images lose their contours. They become very, very soft. So what he's trying to do from the moment he begins to paint is, no matter whether he's using truly a camera obscura or just learning from the experience, he wants to imitate the effect of how images appear when seen through camera lens. Because he feels that that is optically closer to the way the world appears. That this is what's closer to the truth of how things appear to the eye. Let me just show you a couple of other images from this early period that are also exemplifying this tendency to sort of stop the story halfway and keep you suspended in front of the picture. Here is the officer with the laughing girl from the Frick collection. All of these titles have been given by art historians, since we do not know what he would have called the pictures. And of course, any image that shows you a woman by herself with a man, a dashing guy with a big white-brimmed hat and a red coat, is a potentially dangerous situation. She shouldn't be sitting without a chaperone in that room. This could be her, possibly her nice guy, the lover who was away traveling for months, just came back and is telling her about what they found in the East Indies or West Indies, and you see this big map on the wall, and the map is actually of Holland, of Northern Europe, but nothing on this map appears accurate, even though Dutch were the greatest cartographers of the time. One particular art historian long time ago actually wrote a whole study of all of the maps and globes in Vermeer. He identified them. So Vermeer used specific maps and globes. But what he did in this particular case, for instance, is he painted the land surface blue and the water surface ochre. He switched the colors around. He loves doing little things like that, little adjustments, as if to undermine what we think we know, as if to make us question, how do you know? Why are you expecting that? Why do you think she is bad by sitting in the room with him? Of course, there is much more of an innocence in this encounter than in an image such as this one, Peter de Hoogh. You can imagine why early art historians felt that a painting such as the one from the Frick collection would have been by the same artist who painted this. I have a hard time believing that they're by the same artist, but they come from the same sort of realm of scenes of daily life. And in Peter de Hoogh's case, you certainly are looking at something that's not going to have a good end, right? There is the woman, she's telling him, but don't give her any more wine. Stop already. He keeps pouring, she keeps extending her glass. She's already not very stable on that chair. The poor little dog who symbolizes faithfulness in love has fallen asleep by the empty chair, meaning the guy who is not at home. This is not a husband situation. The husband is probably traveling and he said to the guys, when you go back to Delft, visit my wife to tell her I'm fine, give her my letter. Tell her to wait for me. And this is what happens. She's so disappointed that the husband didn't arrive that she's getting herself drunk. I'm joking, but the Dutch loved stories like this in painting. The idea is that they would have these pictures at home and they would be precisely for this purpose, to make your guests laugh when you have dinner, almost like TV show. Sitcom, and then they talk. Is she wrong or is she right? Well, who is this guy on the left? Who is the guy on the right? They were called conversation pieces, conversatie. But Vermeer refuses to play by the rules. He gives you something that is like a conversation piece, but it is so much about intimacy, exchange, dialogue, almost an innocence, right? Something like love as opposed to that by Pieter de Hoogh. So this is the reason why, even though people confused Vermeer with Pieter de Hoogh, it is very difficult to see them in the same space, I mean in the same universe as thinkers. Here is just a close-up. And once again, remember this face, because Vermeer, not being the greatest of draftsmen, even if he used his wife as a model constantly, it is quite conceivable. Actually, I think if he lived at home, if she was always pregnant, if he didn't paint that much, he would always ask Katarina, sit down, please, I need to paint you again, but this time with a gentleman in red, you know. To me, it's much more plausible that the wife would have been that constant model, even if she doesn't look 100% the same in each painting. But you can see here how in the map, on the one hand, we have identified it accurately. On the other hand, it has been shown that he reversed the colors so that he can confuse you. So you do not really know what you're looking at in terms of water versus land. So nothing is what it seems is one of the messages. I will conclude this segment by showing you probably my favorite Vermeer, probably The Woman with the Balance at the National Gallery. So this is probably the best period of Vermeer's work, the mid-60s. It is dated to around this time, but we don't know when exactly. It's not a very large picture. It shows that same generic female face we've been seeing from the procuress down, right? Katarina, it seems, and quite pregnant, it seems. For a long time, art historians were reluctant to acknowledge that this woman could be pregnant. They said that was just the fashion of the day. Yes and no, look at that belly. And why exactly did he have to highlight that little orange there, like a half moon, if it was just the fashion of the day? She is standing in a room weighing what in the balance? Weighing what? Jewelry, because there is jewelry at the table, correct, pearls. And she too comes from a long tradition of women weighing precious things, such as this 16th century artist, Jan Sanders van Hemesen, Woman Weighing Gold. And by the way, these pictures, like Van Hemesen, or like this one, Woman Weighing Gold by Pieter de Hoogh, again, his close contemporary from Delft, automatically had negative connotation. Young woman, why do you spend your life weighing gold? This is not where the real gold is. Young woman, think about what is truly precious. So a woman with a balance, weighing jewelry or weighing gold, was automatically a negative moralistic picture intended to warn you to be mindful of the higher realm, of what you should really measure. So what did Vermeer do as a result? He essentially eliminated everything from his balance. His balance has neither gold nor, I'll show you a close-up later on, nor any coins in it. The balance is perfectly horizontal and empty. And this, of course, has been one of the arguments of art historians that, including my mentor, who actually was a curator at the National Gallery and who was the first one to examine this picture under magnifying glass way back in the 70s and said, hold on one second, there is nothing in the balance. She's not weighing anything. She's just keeping a balance. So Vermeer takes this tradition and disrupts it once again in order to make us stop and think about meaning. And in this case, he underscores the importance of the spiritual versus material by saying, look what's behind her. A very Catholic picture of the Last Judgment, the weighing of the souls. The woman is weighing something, and behind her is Second Coming, Last Judgment, and actually a picture possibly like this one. Jakob de Bakker, a picture like this was in the collection of his mother-in-law. So if a picture like this was in the collection of his mother-in-law, like this, not exactly this one, then who else but his wife would be the woman with the balance, who was always pregnant with those 14 children, right? So in my opinion, this is, and not just my opinion, this is a painting about balance in life and being mindful of the spiritual versus material, and that the judgment that she's making here when she holds the balance is much more about right and wrong as abstractions. And of course, people have argued that this picture also has to do with Calvinist versus Catholic notions of original sin and whether the child upon the birth is already sinful and can be saved just by divine grace, etc., or good works in the Catholic version. So there have been many interpretations, but the most important thing is he undermines that whole tradition of the negative connotation of the woman with the balance and turns this woman into somebody who looks positively Marian, like Virgin Mary herself, with that white cloth over her head, with the blue color of her jacket, which is the color of Virgin Mary. So the whole notion of sin is expelled from this image completely. And I just want to conclude this portion by going back to Montaigne, about whom I spoke yesterday briefly in conjunction with Rembrandt, the writer of the essays from the end of the 16th century. Montaigne, by the way, Michel de Montaigne, who is one of my heroes from that time period, was also a great skeptic or participant in something that we call in European philosophy at the time a revival of skepticism. Skepticism, not necessarily that it means complete atheism, but question assumptions, question what is being told to you as the truth. Look, think, consider, reconsider, do not pass judgments. Skepticism as a kind of conscious self-restraint when it comes to passing judgments. Do not assume that what you see automatically is right or wrong. Think, 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 think. And he actually says this in one passage. This way of speaking in a Christian man has ever seemed to be very indiscreet and irreverent. Irreverent. God cannot die. God cannot contradict himself. God cannot do this or that. I don't like to have the divine power so limited by the laws of men's mouths. How can we know what God can or cannot do? You consider yourself Christian? Where do you find the authority to tell us these things? Be skeptical. Think about how small we all are. And actually, he continues to say, the Pyrrhonian philosophers, those were the ancient skeptics that became very fashionable at this time, cannot express their general conception in any kind of speaking. Ours, meaning us, Christians of today, is all formed of affirmative propositions which are totally hostile to those ancient philosophers. The idea is to understand things by interrogation rather than by claims. What do I know? And then he adds, as I bear it in the emblem of balance. So Montaigne actually chose the empty balance as his emblem. his personal emblem. Maintain an equilibrium. See things from both sides. It can be good or it can be bad. You cannot know. Don't rush to judgment. I know this is a very far-fetched connection. I'm not going to say that Vermeer is reading Montaigne, although he may have been, because Montaigne was quite well known in Europe at this time. His essays were very popular. But I just wanted to tell you that when Vermeer undermines expectations, he's doing it in order to make you stop in front of the painting and rethink everything you know about the subject. And all of a sudden, this is not a woman weighing gold, but a woman thinking about balance. So that's the point. We will stop here now for a little break of about 10 minutes and come back in 2:20, if that's okay, so you can stretch your legs, and we'll have another 45 minutes or so. Thank you. I hope we can continue now because we're already 5 minutes late and I don't want to keep you too long today. But I could be talking about this painting forever. I mean, really forever. But I'm not going to do that in the interest of time, except just to mention that even in this painting, The Woman with the Balance, Vermeer apparently made a number of adjustments and heightened certain colors, underscored certain contrasts. For example, look how in the frame of the painting behind her, on the right side, you have the gilding very prominently shown, those two verticals. Optically, as the light enters into the room, it is possible that only one side of the frame would be illuminated and the other one not so much, but he always highlights things in order to give them both this hyper-real quality and slightly otherworldly quality. And actually, it has been argued that those verticals underscore the verticality and stability of the woman. It's not just an optical effect, but he wanted to use particular visual devices in order to re-emphasize the point that he's making about look at her and think about what she is doing. And by the way, there is one other thing I need to mention before I leave the painting, is that there is a little mirror on the wall, right, that seems to be placed in front of her. And that little mirror would have been also in the 17th century a famously ambiguous symbol. On the one hand, mirror could be symbol of vanity. On the other hand, symbol of self-knowledge and reflection. So in this particular case, Vermeer, definitely, given the fact that the balance is empty, Vermeer is definitely using the mirror in order to talk about reflection and the need for reflection. I apologize for darkening the room. I hope we can safely get back to our seats. And I want to continue after The Woman with the Balance and this philosophical idea that actually in Vermeer everything is about learning and seeing and trying to understand the world through what the world presents to you rather than through prejudgments. And that leads me to another extremely remarkable painting, another of my favorites, but then there are too many of them, it seems. The Geographer. The Geographer. Small work, oil on canvas, with that same famous carpet we saw before, that he uses almost like a visual obstacle to the entry into the room. In the Procuress, there was the crumpled up oriental carpet. In The Girl Asleep, the same carpet. Now in The Geographer. And that carpet both invites you in with its very tactile quality, the beauty of the textile that you can imagine, you can touch, but at the same time creates an obstacle and therefore enhances the privacy of the room. So that it's a private space into which you are not entirely invited. People have said Vermeer is like a voyeur. He looks into the private lives of people. In this case, you have a man. And this man is holding a pair of compasses in his hand, and he is about to make a mark on a plain, big, white, open scroll. You remember the two map circles from Rembrandt yesterday, the unfinished map? Well, here is somebody about to make a map. And as he's making the map, he's looking through the window. And you're saying to yourself, map makers don't sit in their rooms looking through the window, or do they? Where do they make their maps? How do they make their maps? But in that gesture, in that kind of attention, on the one hand, on the white piece of paper in front of him where the map will be drawn, and the gaze focused outside through the window, he's essentially telling you, I'm creating a bridge between macrocosm, the big world, and the microcosm, the world inside, the large world, and how can the world be schematically represented on a limited surface in front of me. So it's once more a scientific endeavor, translation. How is knowledge translated, and how does that chaos, the constant movement of the visible world, become a map? And of course he's a scientist, like Van Leeuwenhoek, and what you see is a globe above him. And every time I look at that globe, I am thinking of the microcosm and the macrocosm. The whole idea that a human being is like a world. I mean, this is what the entire metaphysical poetry is all about. John Donne, etc. No man is an island, right? John Donne was translated in Holland and well read in Holland and imitated by Dutch poets of the time. In fact, I have to admit something. When I went to graduate school, my very first class I wrote a seminar paper on the woman with the balance, and my thesis was to compare her to metaphysical poetry of 17th century. And I haven't done anything with it. Maybe now the time is better, I can go back to it and finally do something with the metaphysical aspect of the woman with the balance. But the point is that here, that globe to me is like the head of the man. The globe, the big world, and me, the small world, doing this transcription and translation. And here you have two signatures, and just to tell you how tricky this situation is, there is ofVermeer with the date, 1668, and it seems as if this is a fake one, but there is another one right here, IMEER, abbreviated, which is apparently the authentic one. It is as if somebody added that signature and date after his death to make the pictures more sellable, to make sure they knew it was Vermeer. I find this signature more plausible, and I like the fact that it is inscribed on the panel, and panel in Holland could also mean a picture. And he's kind of telling you, I made this picture. And of course, the panel is between the head and the globe. So it makes all kinds of interesting connections there. But the geographer is also a geometer. He's somebody who uses mathematics and projection and perspective. And in that sense, he reminds me of this very famous print by Albrecht Dürer, about projection and how do you learn to translate the visible world into a scheme, into a diagram, into a picture. And I mentioned yesterday that map making and painting were also seen as kin, even though they appear so different to us. And then some art historians have argued, and I kind of feel the same way, that maybe there is a bit of melancholia in this scientist. I mean, we often talk about Renaissance science and optimism and new discoveries and all of that. Vermeer being Vermeer knew Dürer. Everybody in Holland knew Dürer. He was like the god of northern art of the 16th century. And Dürer, of course, had created this wonderful, famous engraving, Melancholia, which we could interpret for 1 hour, this engraving, truly. But Melancholia is part of the series that I showed you, Saint Jerome in his Study by Dürer is also part of the same series, the 3 masterpieces of Dürer, the Meisterstücke. And Melancholia is all about how no matter how much you know, you will never know enough. No matter how much you think you can master the world, and you feel that you are like the creator, you are not like the creator. So Dürer's melancholic genius is holding the dividers, but not in a way that can do anything. But this instrument, ever since the Middle Ages, is also seen as attribute of God, the maker, the ultimate geometer. So when you see how prominently Vermeer's geographer is holding the dividers, you cannot but think about the whole idea that this is about making, which is much more than just map making. It's about understanding the world. And on that note, he also paints the same person, it seems, the same person in the same room, or roughly the same room, working in the evening with the globe, known as the astronomer. This is in the Louvre. The first one was in Frankfurt. They're almost never together in exhibitions. 2 years ago, we had the great privilege in Washington to have an exhibition, Vermeer and his contemporaries, and both the astronomer and the geographer traveled there, and we could finally see them side by side. It's not going to happen again, probably, but this time you have this man in the long coat, the scholar's coat, contemplating a celestial globe. And the globe of heavens, of constellations. So the geographer deals with this world, the astronomer with that world, so to speak, metaphorically. And oftentimes people have said, yes, this is about a kind of spiritual knowledge rather than empirical scientific knowledge. Or the geographer is about active life, the astronomer is about contemplative life. And of course, on the back of the wall, instead of a map, there is a painting that has been identified as being on the subject of the finding of Moses. And Moses, among other things, taught the Egyptians about how to read the stars. So, these two pictures are seen as pendants. They were commissioned at the same time. We do not know by whom, but they are the only pictures featuring a male sitter prominently as the central figure. I just want to show you for a moment a comparable picture. You remember Gerrit Douw, Rembrandt's early partner in Leiden? Gerrit Douw, who became very, very well known as a fine painter and who sold his pictures for a lot of money. He also painted this wonderful astronomer here at the Getty. So neither of the two are necessarily unique iconographically. The geographer and the astronomer also come from a tradition of pictures of geographers and astronomers. But what makes them so special is that A, they exist as pendants, counterparts, B, that they seem to be showing the same person doing two different things, and that Vermeer seems to be underscoring the distinction, but also the parallel between these two forms of knowledge: empirical knowledge based on observation and a more spiritual knowledge based on contemplation, or knowledge based on sight and vision versus knowledge based on insight and thought. And in the Renaissance, of course, this correlates to that idea that I already mentioned of vita activa and vita contemplativa, that the ideal of the Renaissance is that you are capable both of action and thought, contemplation. Moreover, even though they're not in the same room, they certainly suggest very, very close correlation, and, at least to my mind, and not just my mind, but some other art historians, they can be plausibly connected to Antony Van Leeuwenhoek, the microscope inventor, who was his friend. And I showed you earlier the portrait of Leeuwenhoek. Of course, it doesn't look like the same person, but then we are talking about two different artists painting this. And what is interesting is that, yes, Leeuwenhoek, well, who lived much longer life until 1723, would also write things like this, that in his own work, he has essentially done everything from a craving after knowledge, which I notice resides in me more, the craving, than in most other men. And therewithal, whenever I found out anything remarkable, I have thought it was my duty to put it down on paper so that all ingenious people might be informed of it. It's wonderful. He was very curious. He was interested in all aspects of knowledge. And even though Van Leeuwenhoek dealt with the microscopically observed reality, I believe that Vermeer may have attempted through these portraits, perhaps even painted for him specifically, to convey the notion that what you observe under the lens is also relatable to the large world. So that Leeuwenhoek is in a sense a geographer of the little things that live within us. So, let me move on now to most of the portraits of women. We have to get to those women after all. And one of the first ones, and I want to start with this one because it highlights so many things about Vermeer, is the woman reading a letter by an open window. The women in Vermeer, as you well know, are usually shown absorbed in an action. They don't exist for our delectation and pleasure. Once again, he's almost like a voyeur looking into a very private space and not just seeing a beautiful form in that space, but a psychological presence. Somebody who is thinking, somebody who is contemplating, somebody who knows what she's imagining as she reads that letter. And once again, he carefully suggests a story and stops us from seeing fully. So these letters are fascinating because epistolary culture was quite alive and well in Holland. All those women living separated from their husbands for months had the highest level of literacy of any other women on the continent. And there were all these manuals for letter writing. So letter writing and subjects of this kind were common. But once more, Vermeer does it in a way which is highly unusual, that instead of creating a space for anecdotes and storytelling, he wants to talk about psychological tensions, expectations, unknowns. And in this particular case, these unknowns are also underscored by that grid-like window that you see behind the woman, where you see a reflection of her face. And that whole idea that the window invites, like, how do I know this woman? Am I seeing the right person? Am I living in a world of mirrors and reflections? Can we know something by looking at her this way, or is there a better way through reflection to get to know her? All kinds of questions are raised by this. He furthermore, not only does he underscore the notion that even vision itself is unreliable, but he also tells you that even painting itself is one big illusion. Look at that curtain in front of the picture. Curtains were hung in front of paintings in 17th century homes, as I said, almost like performance pieces. So you would walk into somebody's house, a curtain would be pulled, and you see the new painting. And it was like a theater. But in this case, he shows you the rod of the curtain as well as the curtain itself. And you are invited to come in and pull the curtain and get to know the rest of the story. And he says, no, no, it's only a painting. You'll never get there. I'm never going to tell you the full story. So the curtain is part of that secretiveness about Vermeer, that whole idea that he never goes all the way to describe and narrate. But furthermore, the curtain here can also be an allusion to another famous story from antiquity about Zeuxis and Parrhasius, two very, very famous painters, like those I mentioned yesterday. Zeuxis, you may recall, painted grapes so well on the wall of his studio that the birds killed themselves as they tried to catch them. But Parrhasius painted a curtain on his wall. So one day when Zeuxis went to Parrhasius' studio and said, let me see what you've been working on, he tried to pull the curtain and he got stuck. And then the story went, Zeuxis fooled the birds, but Parrhasius fooled Zeuxis himself. So who is the greater painter? And this anecdote was told and retold many times. And I am convinced that in this relatively early work, Vermeer is actually showing us both Zeuxis and Parrhasius. You notice the bowl of fruit. The fruit that you want to touch, the Zeuxian grapes, so to speak. So you have the bowl of fruit that is about to fall out into our space, except we'll never get to any of that fruit. And of course, we'll never get beyond the curtain either. So what am I trying to say here? Vermeer is a savvy guy, knows an awful lot. We have no clue what he read, what kinds of books were in that house. But he certainly knew all kinds of things about art theory and about these ancient artists. Another woman that I want to briefly discuss, and look, another yellow jacket lined with fur, exactly like in the inventory of his estate. And then in some pictures, the yellow jacket becomes blue, like the woman with the balance, because he needs blue because she's like Virgin Mary. But this one is the yellow jacket proper, and this time the woman who doesn't look like that other woman we've been seeing, this seems to be another model, is tying a necklace around her neck. And similarly to the woman with the balance, very similarly to the woman with the balance, Vermeer began by addressing a subject which had a very long history in the visual culture. That subject is something that we call Lady World. Lady World is a gorgeous woman tying a necklace in front of a mirror, signifying vanity. Lady World. And Lady World usually has a big map on the wall behind her. So what did Vermeer do? He began the picture by painting somebody akin to Lady World. As this slide shows you, what he did was that there was a map, X-rays indicate, there was also a musical instrument, which is also a symbol of seduction and the seductions of worldliness. So in contemporary images of Lady World, you will see a beautiful woman sort of contemplating her own beauty in a mirror, and behind her a map and a musical instrument. And then he said, no, I don't want to go there. And he began eliminating and covered up the musical instrument as well as the map in order to turn her from something very clearly negative into, again, an image in which you concentrate on the figure and you cannot instantly say, this is who she is. But you have to think and you have to stop judging. So she's just a beautiful woman all of a sudden, rather than lady world. So this idea of concentration or distillation is definitely one of the hallmarks of his work. This notion that all of the unnecessary details are eliminated so that you can focus on the person, you can somehow get this purer perspective on this other subjectivity, on this other human being in this room whom you're observing carefully, like this gorgeous woman from the Met who is just pouring water or holding the pitcher while opening the window with her other hand. And that idea of being caught between two actions, I always see her as the sister of the geographer. Somehow, there is the window, there she is, one hand here, another hand there, but this one ostensibly doing nothing important. But by isolating her, by elevating her in this way, he makes you say, look at the world is full of signs if you can read them. There is a lot of knowledge if you care to watch, if you care to look carefully. And in this case, yes, the carpet, yes, those beautiful clothes that you find on other women of Vermeer, yes, that white cover, yes, that face that reminds us of the woman with the balance, and then reflections of the carpet on this wonderful brass polished platter. He even paints the reflections of those patterns of the carpet. So look and observe is what he's trying to tell you, rather than read a picture in a predictable fashion like Peter de Hoogh with the linen closet. I'm not saying Peter de Hoogh is bad, but Peter de Hoogh is more ordinary in his way of thinking. Pictures are very emblematic, full of incidental quality, full of narrative prompts, whereas in Vermeer, everything becomes super focused on a single person, a protagonist, and they may be doing nothing important. And yet, that's where the secret of being is. In ordinary stuff, very ordinary things. The Yellowjacket again. The lady writing a letter, another of my favorites, probably because she's at the National Gallery. Adorable. And her face is the face of the woman with the balance, I claim. And, of course, women who are writing letters are common. Here you have Gabriel Metsu, but what a world of difference. Metsu is a very fine artist, but he needs everything. The very well-appointed room, the very beautiful clothing, the dog symbolizing loyalty, the lady coquettishly smiling towards us, the beholder, the male beholder to whom she writes her letter. Vermeer's woman is also writing her letter or looking up to see that male beholder. But look how much more solemn she is. And how serious and grave in that exchange. And I feel in this case that the way she holds that quill compares to the way in which an artist holds a brush, symbolically. I write to you the way you paint me. It's almost like a silent exchange between her, and I would say, that's the wife, her, and the painter. I will sit here, you will paint me, and I will be writing to you. And it's like an even exchange, and even interestingly enough, as you know, painters were compared to poets, and painters were seen as inferior to writers because writers and the letters can speak of the soul, whereas painters can only speak of the body. And Vermeer seems to be giving her the supremacy here as the writer while he is painting her. And look at the faces. I see a very similar face here. And I see a very similar face even in these three. So my argument is that definitely the wife was there as a model very, very prominently. However, she was not the only model. We finally get to this girl from 1665, circa 1665. And of course, much has been written about the girl with the pearl earring, and I do not have any specific interpretation regarding who she may be, but I certainly see that she's different from the face we've been seeing so far. But is this a Dutch girl? No. Is she of this realm? Not necessarily. You know what was interesting? At this time, one subject that was very popular in Europe was portraits of sibyls. Sibyls, Sibyl-like women, like Sibyllin prophecies. And the sibyls were usually shown wearing turban-like headgear, fanciful headdresses of these sorts. I'm not saying that she's a sibyl, but she's definitely not a Dutch woman. And if anything, she resembles these people with the turbans. Like in Hendrik Verbruggen's Musicians, the painting that was in the mother's collection. She is, in other words, an exotic object. I actually see this woman in many ways as a precious beauty who is not a portrait per se, but she is what the Dutch would have said, a tronie, T-R-O-N-I-E. In Dutch inventories of the 17th century, a tronie was just a beautiful head or a bust-length portrait of an interesting character, a tronie. And I feel, and I'm not the